What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Alan Wake 2, which I finally got around to, trying to get ahead of the release of Control Resonant a little later this year, though this game in particular did release a few years ago. That said, I review games like this all the time. There's a link below covering everything I go over. My Steam profile is linked below as well, but as many people know, in the case of this game, that's not going to be super useful, as this game released purely on the Epic launcher when it comes to PC, and so you can see the achievements over there on screen. Obviously, I did not get a review key for this. I just wanted to check it out, and so I paid for it over on the Epic launcher out of my own pocket and dove into it from there. With that in mind, a couple of things I want to go over before we dive fully in here. One, I am not necessarily going to spoil the entirety of the game, but there are things I want to talk about here that are absolutely spoilers. We're a few years post-release, so I don't really care to do that personally at this point, but if you clicked on this review hoping to learn about the game to make a purchasing decision, you might just want to say jump to the end, or maybe come back and watch it later, because my recommendation would be to play the game for yourself. It's a bit of an experience, and honestly, I think hearing too much about it in general beforehand is probably not great for the experience, and as a result, think of this video more as like a debriefing on my own experiences at the very least, but certainly feel free to share yours down in the comments. But either way, expect some spoilers. The other thing, let's talk about the Epic launcher. Kind of annoying to me personally. However, as much as I do not like the Epic launcher, it's hard not to give them a pass on this case because Epic funded and published this game, so Alan Wake 2 simply would not exist without them. And you compare that to all of the incredibly annoying exclusivity rights buying that they were doing to get games purely on the Epic launcher for a while, and it's honestly night and day. Here, I think they did the right thing, which was actually funded and published that game, and then, if they want to have exclusivity of it at that point, that's their right. I will say it is an absolute shame that this game is not more widely available, because I think that's a big part of what is holding it back, and while it eventually spun a profit, all that really does to me is make it seem even more ridiculous that after having recouped all the cost with it, they have still not pushed it out there where more people can find and buy it so they can make some of that money. But I suppose that's a conversation for a different video. Otherwise, let's dive straight into this. So, I played Alan Wake 1 recently, like just a few months ago, in fact, in preparation for playing Alan Wake 2. In fact, one of the reasons I didn't review this game when it released was specifically because I had not played Alan Wake 1 yet, and then combined with it being on the Epic launcher, those two things made it easy to pass by at the time. But with the announcement of Control Resonant carrying forward the universe and everything, it just made a lot of sense to dive in here finally. And yet, Alan Wake 1 is an older title. Not ancient or anything, but a little bit older, and so it's perhaps unsurprising then that some of the mechanics evolved and changed from that release. Mostly for the best. A couple of them I don't care for. They changed how the flashlight works, and while I'm fine with them having the batteries for it be a little less available, like they changed the fundamental of like how the charges work to break the darkness shields on enemies, and it's frustrating more than anything else. I also think the boss fights are a little underwhelming, and in spite of that, most everything else about the game is just an experience, honestly. And we're going to break down some of that, of course, over the course of this review. But I also wanted to mention that post-launch, this game got some love as well in the form of, I would say, three major things to know about, which is the big final draft update, which added New Game Plus, which gave access to the true ending, which, by the way, the achievements are very thorough for everything except the New Game Plus ending. But on top of that, they also released 2 paid DLC for it, which I played through and will cover here as well. And one of them in particular, the Lake House, is, I would say, chock full of lead-in stuff to Control Resonant if you kind of dig in there a little. Otherwise, let's talk technical state. How was this running? I personally didn't really have any issues with it other than a small recording thing that had nothing to do with the game, and so isn't really worth mentioning here, of course. But otherwise, pretty smooth sailing. I'm sure if you dig deep enough, there are probably some problems people are running into, but otherwise it seems to run well enough. Which brings us to difficulty. Now, this game does an interesting thing with its difficulty. So it is primarily a survival horror title, yes, but there's also a whole bunch of options the game doesn't immediately tell you about to make it easier for yourself if you want to outside of the presets. The preset difficulties are there. Once you unlock the final draft, you can even play on Nightmare, which is the hardest difficulty, just like the original title. Here's the thing, outside of the presets, and again, if something actually tells you about this, I must have missed it, but if you go into the gameplay options in the menu, there's a whole bunch of other things you can tweak, including an invincibility mode, and some other just generally helpful gameplay settings, and the thing is, these are are seemingly unaffected by difficulty, just so you're aware. That's an option for you if you're struggling, I suppose. But honestly, the game's not too bad. In fact, there's something you can do with containers to exploit them and get a whole bunch more resources than you should, because the containers inventory is based on what is currently in your inventory, and if you throw everything in storage in the break rooms, you can then go open up the containers and loot a bunch of stuff you would not get otherwise, and that is, of course, pretty exploitable. So there is that, I suppose. Long story short, you should be able to find a difficulty for you here somewhere, and that then brings us to the story, which is by far the most interesting part of this game, I would say. There's a lot I want to talk about here. Again, I'm not going to go like plot beat by plot beat or anything, but I want to talk about the basic structure and setup of the thing, and then talk about some of the more interesting elements of the story that I found. There will be spoilers, though. So, structurally speaking, this game is interesting because you ultimately have two different campaigns. You play between Saga Anderson and Alan Wake. Alan Wake is still trapped in the dark place following the events of the original game. He is trying to get out, and the thing about Alan Wake is that he can turn his writings into reality, but it's a tricky thing. It's not as easy as just writing something and it instantly becomes true. It's a little more complicated than that. He's been trying to escape by writing a bunch of stories, and 13 years after the events of that original game, when people start disappearing and showing up in ritualistic murders, it draws the attention of the FBI and one special agent, Saga Anderson. Now, Saga's campaign takes place in the real world, whereas Alan Wake's takes place in the dark place. The catch being that each of these characters has to have the first sections of their individual campaigns played in a sort of set scenario. Once you reach a certain point, you unlock the ability to swap back and forth between them, but in order to reach the end, you have to bring both of them to the end point of their respective campaigns before you can do the finale. So while the beginning and the end are relatively set, the middle you can tackle in basically any which order you please. Each of them has slightly different progression mechanics, a few quirks in terms of like weapons and everything. Alan Wake in particular leans into his ability to write things into existence, so there's that. But let's talk a little more straightforwardly here, because these ritualistic murders are being performed by a cult called the Cult of the Tree. I keep wanting to call them the Cult of the Deer because they wear deer masks and there are deer things everywhere, including a festival called Deer Fest. But as Saga Anderson's investigation will quickly make you realize, there's obviously something more going on here, outside of just the prior knowledge of Alan Wake himself, of course, being in the dark place, or if you've played Control, you know potentially all about how Bright Falls, the primary setting of the game, is a place where an AWE, or an altered world event, seems to happen with regularity. This is because of a threshold hidden in the lake here, a place where an alternate reality sort of seeps through, and that veil is relatively thin, one of those being the dark place. But here's where things get crazy. The entire story is basically iterations of Alan Wake trying to escape. And the thing is, where it gets extraordinarily meta, to say the least, is that they start roping in not only like general literary devices, but also the process of writing something itself into how the narrative is unfolding. To just sort of quote the end, it's not a loop, it's a spiral. See, what you are going through as you play the game has happened, and it will likely happen again until the final draft playthrough where it ends, but essentially, again, the story is just an iterative process of Alan Wake writing and rewriting this story as he tries to ascend out of the dark place in what can only be contextually described as a spiral upward. Now, the game more or less spells that out for you towards the end. Where it gets really interesting, though, to me at least, is in some of the details. In fact, Alan Wake himself said something towards the end of the game that really stuck with me about it, which is that when you are writing something and you edit or make a change to the middle of it, you affect not only what comes after, but what came before as well, just by the very nature of a story. And so they use that to sort of frame what has been happening around you as the story unfolds. There are people who remember things a little different. There are people who are just a little bit off in a weird way that isn't necessarily explained, outside of the fact that these weird happenings are because the story is being adjusted and changed here and there as this process has continued and will continue. But to sort of bring that to a close, then you have New Game Plus, or the final draft. This is theoretically the playthrough where Alan Wake, who narrates some of the game, as well as yourself, will know what is happening here, and so some things change. Playing through on New Game Plus is what gives you the true ending, where Alan Wake finally escapes, the sort of culmination of all his work and editing up to this point. Now, while that playthrough will be mostly the same, they did change a couple of things beyond the ending, mostly just like narration and some little stuff here and there. If I'm being completely honest, as much as I think the story is great, you could probably watch a YouTube video and get the gist of it much more quickly rather than replaying through the whole thing. But there's also another thing I wanted to talk about, even just beyond how cool I thought a lot of that was, which was the way they changed Scratch. So Mr. Scratch is an entity that only gets a brief mention in the original title, but is the subject of the standalone expansion, American Nightmare. Mr. Scratch is basically a dark, evil twin of Alan Wake, brought manifest by the dark place and the power it tries to manifest in taking advantage of artists in order to turn their work into reality. Alan Wake's not unique in that sense. There have been others like Thomas Zane. But what was really interesting was Scratch in particular because, again, they changed some of the way he is presented. In American Nightmare and his brief mention in the original, when people say his name, it's pronounced as like TV static. And because of the way the first game is also presented as a sort of TV show, he's even like associated with TV screens in the original game, and then American Nightmare, it's kind of the same thing. But here in Alan Wake 2, they changed that a little bit, presumably because of your interactions with him perhaps, and even in that American Nightmare expansion there was like an element of like looping the story back around to change things, which is very reminiscent of what they did here in Alan Wake 2. But what I want to talk about in particular is they changed Mr. Scratch for Scratch to be more like the concept of scratching something out and editing it, with the idea that Scratch has found the stories that Alan Wake is writing in order to get out, in order to sort of rewrite that to his nefarious end. And I thought that was just a really interesting way to change the way that character was presented in how the story is unfolding, like the medium of TV versus the medium of like the process of writing, as an example. So just thought that was cool, and I think it actually does make sense because of the way the Dark Place is said to adapt to the person whose art it is trying to make manifest. And there are, of course, various types of writing. So I just thought that was a neat little detail outside of the things I've mentioned. And that's to say nothing of like the big moments throughout playing it. Like the musical one has gotten, I would say, a lot of attention. And to be honest with you, that level is a lot of fun. I can see why people are into it. There's also a lot of other just really cool moments as you move through. And that is something the original game also did really well on occasion. But unfortunately, what happens is you tend to do all of this build-up and then get to a boss that is just the worst. Like an enemy with slightly more health most of the time, and it's just kind of boring. Now, the other thing I want to mention before we move on story-wise is that Alan Wake and Saga both have slightly different variations of how they unfold their story, with Saga, being a detective, has a bit of a mind place instead of a mind palace, a mind place which allows her to sort of categorize and handle all the various information she is receiving, and as a result her campaign feels a little more like detective work. And in some ways there's like detective work in that mind place you have to do before the story will advance sometimes, which is a little awkward in places. And then there's Alan Wake's writing room, which is kind of a similar concept, but it's where he goes to look at the plot board of the thing he is experiencing, and he can change some of the plot elements, which like physically changes the things around you and how it progresses through that way. So even gameplay-wise, there are some differences. Overall, though, incredible bit of storytelling. The stuff I liked most about it, outside of just the actual minute-to-minute plot beat, was really just the way they, I think, weaved in the concept of the process of writing something like that into the narrative itself. That was just cool to me. And yet, we are not done, because now we need to talk about progression, which is relatively simple, but it is split between the two characters. Saga has her charm bracelet, as well as the various weapons she'll be picking up, with the charm bracelet giving you all sorts of little perks, including these coffee charms that will prevent you from dying but break upon use if you want. And then if you solve one of the side puzzles enough, you can actually get a fourth charm slot instead of 3. And that, combined with the different weaponry you'll be coming across, is most of her progression pretty much right there. And on top of that, if you find these lunch boxes hidden around while playing as Saga, she can pick up a bunch of manuscript fragments which allow her to upgrade her guns. But that's kind of the gist of it. Alan Wake's side of things is actually a little more involved. He can find words of power, or like perk points more or less, to spend in a variety of different things to give him like little buffs and upgrades as you move through the Dark Place. On top of that, his plot elements give him the ability to, again, change some of the areas he comes across, which has its own sort of progression, not only for the story, but also the things you can actually find, which includes the different weapons available to him specifically. Now, with this being primarily a survival horror title, that's pretty much all there is to progression, not really too much more to write home about. So let's keep it moving to the gameplay and world section. Now, this is another area they made some pretty big changes because the game is divided up into a variety of different hub areas. This is, of course, stuff like the differences between Saga and Alan Wake's campaign with him being trapped in the dark place, yes, but for instance, Saga will have access to places like the Cauldron Lake area, the Bright Falls area, and each of those spots individually is relatively explorable, and there's collectibles and things to find. And while there are cutoff points, at which point you'll no longer be able to access those things, you're much more free to explore, especially in Saga's area in particular. Now, on the flip side, Alan Wake's campaign, you're stuck in the dark place, and while there is a hub you'll be exploring and expanding on as his chapters progress, I did find two things. One, his area is a bit smaller overall, and there's less exploration because it is a little more focused, and first you're going to go to this area, and then on the next chapter you'll go to this area, that kind of thing. But he does have some unique mechanics as well, in that he has to transfer lights via his angel lamp, which the lights will affect the dark place then and allow things to also physically change, which is another way he can sort of move things around. And so his is, again, a little more linear and a little bit odder as a result of that overall. Perhaps unsurprisingly then, given the nature of that, Saga has more things to discover and find than Alan Wake does, but he has a couple of things as well, such as the Words of Power, new weapons, stashes, interesting lore in the form of some of his characters come to life. One of them that is recurring is Sam Lake, really, but rather Alex Casey, who is one of the characters from Wake's novels, but is also this FBI agent that is helping Saga out, who is played by Sam Lake, one of the chief people behind the game. That gets extremely meta because Sam Lake was also the face for Max Payne. He was involved in Quantum Break, and while a lot of those references and things are brought into the game, they legally don't own those franchises, so that gets a little bit meta. There is a part of the DLC, Night Springs DLC, where he just straight up plays himself. So there's a lot going on with that character that actually seeps into both bits of progress. Otherwise, though, you're pretty much looking for collectibles and resources as you move through the given area that you happen to be in. For Saga, this can include things like the nursery rhymes, which involves you collecting all these dolls to solve these little rhymes, which is what gives you eventually access to that fourth piece. You can also just explore and kind of take in the very creepy atmosphere of this place, do a little exploration, or even uncover stashes associated with the cult that is a big player in the overall story. But for the most part, honestly, pretty standard survival horror stuff from what I can tell. But there are a couple of things I wanted to talk about a little more specifically, and that was some of the way Alan Wake approaches combat, as well as some of the changes they made broadly, to flashlights in general. So this is a little bit of combat as well, to be honest, because it plays a role there, but they changed the flashlight. So in the original game, the flashlight was just a single bar of charge, and it would recharge if you weren't using it, but if you used too much of it at once, you would burn through batteries. They made the batteries a little too available on basically every difficulty, so this was trivial to deal with. However, while they reduced the number of batteries this time around, assuming you aren't exploiting that little container bug I mentioned, the flashlight now is broken up into different charges you can use. So when you activate the flashlight boost, outside of just its regular function to break away the darkness shield on an enemy before you're allowed to actually hit them, it is always going to burn that full charge. Now, if you manage to land it on that enemy's shield point exactly, it'll burn the whole way through on a single charge. But that's actually really hard to do because those points move. That's another change where you could just highlight the enemy in general from the first game. Ultimately, what this means is not only do you have less batteries, but you're also burning through more of them because of the way they made this change, and I didn't love the way that felt personally. Even if you can go into the assistance options in the menu and I think make it unlimited, it just kind of undercuts some of the core gameplay loop when it feels like you're being punished not so much for doing the wrong thing, but just getting unlucky on where the shield point is on an enemy. Then there's Alan Wake's stuff. As I already mentioned, he has access to a few things that allow him to change the world around him, which then, of course, changes how you can actually go through and explore a given area, and they play into that a lot over in his part of the story. On Saga's, what you'll do kind of instead of that is pick up a bunch of items along the main story route, then give you access to previously inaccessible areas, which, as you would probably not be surprised to learn, is typically where a lot of stuff is hidden that you can find and explore. Now, presumably, along the way, during all of that, you're going to need a safe place to rest, which is where the break rooms come in. In the original game, you could basically find these lampposts, which would act as like checkpoints and restore some of your health, and while you can find points like that still, they're not really like the main major points, because those are the break rooms. Break rooms are where you're going to go to make a manual save, access your storage, and generally be safe from the onslaught of the Taken, the actual guys you're fighting. Don't think I actually used their name up to this point, but that's kind of the gist of what you're looking at gameplay-wise, and so let's talk now about combat specifically. Honestly, if you played the original, you should feel right at home here. If anything, there are less enemies overall, and especially in Alan Wake's campaign, enemies felt relatively rare there, as they are these shadows that sometimes don't even acknowledge you or anything, and it's pretty easy to tell the ones that are about to, and so there was just significantly less combat in that particular campaign. But otherwise, you are fighting the Taken. They come in a few different types. Sometimes it can infect wildlife, like wolves that you'll have to fight, but for the most part, the basic types of Taken are who will just make general attacks. There's one that throws stuff at you, and there's like a heavy who will use bigger stuff. Now, they changed the way the perfect dodge works here. Most of the time, you will just regularly dodge an enemy, and it's actually really hard to perfectly dodge the Taken enemies, whereas the wolves are super easy to perfectly dodge against. And that's mostly due to timing. Now, the reason you want to do a perfect dodge is because if you pull it off, the enemy stumbles and becomes an easy target. But they made it so deeply unfun to do against the basic Taken that's really just not worth the time, like 90% of the time in my opinion. So there's that. Now, either way, when you fight these enemies, as I mentioned, you're going to have to use your flashlight to attack those shield points, and unfortunately, those shield points have a bit of variation into where they actually are, and you can't just highlight the enemy more generally like the original game, which can be a little frustrating for me personally, at least. But once that shield is down, you can sometimes attack the sort of red weakness point, which will deal a bunch of damage, or just, unload your weapons more generally, as you would expect, and those will have various levels of effectiveness based on what exactly you're using and your upgrades. Now, Alan Wake has his Words of Power, whereas Saga has her manuscript fragments that she can pick up and upgrade her weapons that way, and so they actually, even between the two of them, have different upgrades and a slight variation on the weapons that are available to them, which means they do play a little bit differently, as you would probably expect. Now, I would say the real issue combat-wise is just the boss fights. Man, what a letdown. Every sort of main section of the game, if you will, leads up to an encounter, especially on Saga's end, with a big sort of entity that is causing problems. The build-up and the way to that enemy, and trying to figure out how to get into the area where this enemy is accessed, and that is usually called the overlap there, but you have to get into the overlap by performing some ritual, which you have to learn about through your investigations. And again, there's just like a decent amount of build-up to these boss fights, and then the boss fights kind of suck. They're usually just slightly more tanky versions of regular enemies. The only one that I really feel like they tried to do anything cool with was the lady in the water, Cynthia, and even that one falls a little flat once you solve the water problem. So combat is fine. I think it serves this particular game well enough, and I think they did a better job of juggling resources if you aren't intentionally exploiting it than they did the original game as well. But with all the difficulty options, it's as easy or as difficult as you want it to be. Which then brings us to the DLC. So this game got 2 paid expansions, and they are Night Springs and the Lake House. Night Springs is just really, really funny. Probably worth a mention before we talk about either of these, though, that they are accessible via the main campaign. You don't have to do them there. You can access them from the main menu, and they're the same no matter how you do that, so really just whatever floats your boat on that front. But on that front, Night Springs was just so funny. It's 3 little short stories that kind of get a little crazy with it and tell you some fun stuff that could happen, usually centered a little bit around the character of Mr. Door, who comes up via this talk show that you'll have seen in the footage by now, and kind of leans into like what his whole deal is, because that doesn't really get addressed in the main campaign much. In the first story, you play as Rose, the fan who is just enamored with Alan Wake, who gets all of her dreams to come true, but it's very over the top and silly, and they give her an automatic shotgun with nearly unlimited ammo, and it's just really fun to blow things away as Rose. The next one actually sees you playing as Jesse Faden, trying to investigate leads into her missing brother that you'll know about as part of Control, of course. This is centered around the game's abandoned amusement park, Coffee World, and it's just kind of a jokey thing they got going on there, which was fun. And then the last one is a sort of homage to Quantum Break, it would seem. Now, Quantum Break is not officially part of the Remedy universe because it cannot be, and yet they make a bunch of sort of references to that, especially with the Time Breakers part of the Night Springs DLC. Sheriff Breaker is played by the person who played the guy from Quantum Break, and his name is Sheriff Breaker, so a lot of stuff is pretty on the nose there, and then that one is just kind of all about that and does some fun and interesting things, I would say. The much bigger one really, though, is the Lake House. So one of the things that comes up throughout the game is the FBC, and I wanted to save talking about them until this point because the FBC, or the Federal Bureau of Control, plays a big part in the game Control. We learn all about them and what they are up to, what they've been doing, what their goal is, which is basically to understand and contain the supernatural sort of SCP style, if you will. We encounter one of them pretty directly, Agent Estevez, as she arrives to try to deal with the Altered World event going on here as part of the story, but before she came here, she first stopped by the Lake House, which is the area from which they monitor Cauldron Lake, where all this crazy stuff happens with some regularity, and thus warranted them putting up a post to examine it from. Unfortunately, she arrives to find her colleagues in a state of disarray, having examined the propensity of the dark place and it coming through the threshold to mess with artists. They brought a bunch of artists to the Lake House to try to specifically get the supernatural to interact with their art so they could learn and experiment with it, and unsurprisingly, that science ran amok and we gotta put it down. Brotherhood of Steel, wait, that's the wrong game, never mind. You gotta get to the bottom of it and deal with it. That was just like a really fun DLC, and because it deals so heavily with the FBC, it has some tie-ins pretty directly into Control Resonant coming up, which was a lot of fun. Now, that does bring us to the Steam Deck section before we start talking positives and negatives here. So despite this being an Epic launcher exclusive, if you will, the game is playable on the Steam Deck, but you have to jump through a couple hoops, like going into the desktop mode and then downloading it via that launcher and playing it basically through that mode. To that end, combined with the fact that it was very clearly not made for the Steam Deck, you're probably going to struggle to get a decent frame rate with it. And while it's not technically speaking unplayable, there are better experiences to be had, I would say. So in that way, unless you're desperate, it probably wouldn't be my first choice. On the positive side of things, the story, the atmosphere, the ability to explore some of the places that were much more linear levels in the original game were awesome. I really had a lot of fun going through that. I think the story is just wonderfully well told. I could see, because of the way it's structured, it being a little much for some people. But personally, I just had a blast with it. I think some of the things they did, not only with the story and everything, but like literally the process of writing and how they sort of folded that into the storytelling was just incredibly well done. On the negative side, though, I gotta tell you, I don't like some of the changes they made, even just coming from Alan Wake 1 earlier this year. And I think that probably doesn't matter a ton because of the way they've adjusted the difficulty options and given you options around those things. But like just as a baseline normal experience, not a huge fan. But the flashlight change in particular was especially bad for me. But then there's also the boss fights. I've mentioned that a couple of times. Very, very underwhelming experiences, and they feel particularly underwhelming here, specifically because they do such a good job of building up to them, and then they just completely drop the ball in the actual encounter, and it just kind of blows. But that brings me to my conclusion. Alan Wake 2 is honestly a little bit expensive. It does not seem to go on sale very often, even over on the Epic launcher. The base game is $50, but if you want the version with the DLC, that's going to run you about $70, and for that, I think you're getting a really unique experience that is probably going to run you like 20, 30 hours if you do a run of the main story and DLC just once. If you play through it again for the true ending via the Final Draft New Game Plus, you'll likely spend more time with it, of course, but overall, honestly, just a tremendous experience. It's one of those games where the experience of it and kind of going through the story and what they've done with it is enough on its own to justify to be worth the price of admission, but I also do think it really sucks this game isn't more widely available, especially now that we know the game has since recouped its development cost and become profitable and everything. Why not just make this more widely available? Now, I know the answer to it, and I don't really want to get into it for the sake of this video because I think it's dumb, but what I do know is that dumb thing is in fact stifling the reach of this otherwise incredible experience and keeping it from people, which is just a real shame, because this game, like the first game, is really something pretty cool. Which is where I'm going to leave this video. I would recommend you buy it when you can find it at a price you would agree with, because it really was just an awesome experience. But that is pretty much going to do it for today. Certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.